Hello and welcome everybody. Welcome to game review number 6 of Ding Liren versus Gukesh in the World Chess Championships 2024. Let's see what Ding Liren brought to the table with his third white opening. And it was pawn d4, his third separate choice of opening. He's tried knight f3 on move 1 and e4, and he's now tried d4. Clearly quite an holistic approach, trying various different openings, semi-tricking Gukesh into spending time prepping for these, and in reality playing different openings, possibly in it. Of course, Gukesh, having spent months preparing since April when he was crowned the candidate, has clearly come very prepared as well. This would not have been a surprise. They would have prepared for this, as with pretty much all openings that are mainstream and logical. As it was, Gukesh, very logically, knight f6, not committing any pawns, and bishop f4, the London system. Well, an interesting choice, very topical in recent years, played by even Magnus Carlsen against Ding Liren himself just a couple of years ago in 2023, I think it was. And, well, let's see what setup Gukesh decided to construct. And it was d5, very logically, just controlling the center. Generally, the best structures in these systems are just to strike back at d4 pretty swiftly. Whilst there are other choices, this just clarifies in the center that, okay, this pawn's on c5, I'm putting pressure on d4, and therefore d3, e6, knight f3, and c5. So we saw that structure in the game. And after c3, the typical pyramid of pawns constructed in London system, black doesn't really want to capture, because then that would allow either c takes or e takes, and it clarifies the structure a bit too much. We want to keep the tension for as long as possible, and white would get a nice Carlsbad position potentially, or indeed they could even take and maybe use the c-file. We do have a bishop here, of course, albeit parried by bishop d6. Indeed, something similar was seen, except with the addition of the tension here, where bishop c3 and bishop d6 were played, and bishop b5 was played in the game. The other option is bishop g3 by white, and there follows castles, knight bd2, perhaps knight c6 with b6, bishop b7, queen c7, all being typical plans. Bishop d3 by white. Black usually aims for some kind of e5 push. Likewise, white aims for an e4 push. It's worth noting bishop takes g3, releasing the tension. Whilst playable for black, this is not exactly desirable. Just opens up activity, hence why white often delays castling. And it would have been an entirely different game. One that Ding clearly avoided by, at this moment here, after bishop d6. The other alternative of bishop b5 was played, and after knight c6, an immediate captures, fixing the weakness on c6. There followed a further trade-off of bishops, leaving black against the knight pair for white, and simply a knight and a bishop for black. And queen a4, and this is the moment where Magnus Carlsen himself with white had been facing Ding with black in a Tata Steel 2023 tournament. And in that game, there followed castles, just as Gukesh did today, but white castled here, and then a mass liquidation in the center came off. The weakness is not so fixed. There's maybe a little something for white, but after knight bd2, c4, perhaps white has an outside pass pawn hope, especially if this happens, and maybe there's some small hope, but with the bishop being long range and able to attack some light squares, roughly level. Ding instead, after castles for Gukesh, played queen a3, pinning very, very quickly, and this invites knight e4 to defend. Pretty much the only move. Knight d7 is also possible, but not particularly nice to go backwards. Still playable, but knight e4 makes a lot of sense. Coming in, occupying the center. There followed knight fd2, and the reason for this is if you were to develop like this, there's some positions where when you take, the knight is gained a tempo on, whereas knight fd2, very specific, and clearly in preparation based on 3 minutes of time used. And Gukesh later clarified he had seen this position up until about 5 moves from now, and e5, striking. Well, makes sense if your opponent is retreating, strike where they are leaving defense. But this has all been seen, and actually there's a Hari Krishna Vidit game which After captures, queen takes. The trade would leave a very precarious bishop with not any targets, and meanwhile these two are an immediate target, and if you ever play f5, that leaves this guy behind. It'd be a very unpleasant endgame. And something similar was seen in the Hare Krishna Vidic game, where queen g6, knight d2. And now, I imagine Ding was hoping Gukesh would feel like the obvious move e takes d4 would happen, as in Hare Krishna and Vidic. But after queen takes d4, once again, this pawn's a little bit overstretched. If it ever captures, there's 1,000 different issues. Now that the queen has been helped to d4, this is borderline lost for black. This isn't what happened. Indeed, after queen takes d4, rook e8 to support. There followed castles, bishop f5, and the game went on to be a draw, but black had absolutely no fun here in the Hare Krishna Vidic game. Clearly, Gukesh, as he clarified, had seen such ideas, and so after knight d2, he captured on g2, mainly to win the pawn and force castles, and now queen takes f2. Less to win a pawn, although it's helpful and it attacks a third, but more to get it off the g-file, which would be a bit of a problem. There followed d takes to protect the e3 pawn, and after 6 minutes of thought, Gukesh played rook b8, very logically on a semi-open file, of course preventing the mate threat in 1, or from the mate threat in 1, the loss of the pawn. So Ding, obviously having seen this, played knight to c4, and after bishop e6, rook d2, and it was pointed out in commentary that they'd received word from their team that queen f3 had been extensively analysed earlier this month on the Chess-Based Live opening book, where, well, as was pointed out, I wonder who that could have been. Very likely this had been seen by Ding's team. And although it's objectively level, and indeed the Leela Zero engine that they were using said a huge chance for a draw, roughly level chances to win for both sides, in the area of 20%, but a huge chance for a draw because of some very, very deep moments. Gukesh, on the other hand, evidently, compared to Ding, who had very likely seen this position over a month ago, over a couple of weeks ago anyway, possibly Gukesh would have been a little bit out of their comfort zone, having to work it out all over the board. Indeed, rook e1, overprotecting e3, now, of course, as Gukesh played after 20 minutes thought, really signalling that he was having to work everything out. Meanwhile, Ding, 7 minutes, plenty of time, left at least. Queen f5, and now, well, firstly, the queen was able to take on c4, so now that e3 was protected, white can get down to the business of occupying the f-file. And that's why Ding, after 40 minutes of thought, played queen takes c6. And presumably they were trying to recall, do I play rook f1, go for an attack down here? But then, firstly, the e-pawn can drop, and if this, then just queen e6, and everything's actually defended. It's worth noting if the rooks come off, as one pair at least is pretty much compelled to now, black can only be better, certainly no worse. So that wouldn't help, and there's also the option of queen h3, eyeing up these. White can be active, but ultimately this would very likely fizzle out from losing the e-pawn, and you can imagine various issues. Back to the game. Queen takes c6 at this moment here. And white still is a little bit better, perhaps, and indeed Ding very likely would have known the ideas, but Gukesh parrying everything thus far. Queen takes pawn, not losing a pawn, eyeing up h2 perhaps. He's defended from this lovely rook on d2. And white's rooks are slightly better. They have a lot of activity. But black's rooks aren't the worst in the world right now. And after queen d5, offering a trade, worth noting, if captures, this would really exacerbate white's very, very powerful rooks, because from here, they're able to go across the entire board, maybe go to e5, come to d7, maybe to g1, and it would be very tough for black to hold the fort here. So for that reason, Gukesh attempted, after queen d5, to keep the queens on, and Ding Liren insisted with very similar ideas. If queen takes, Black might well not be even hugely worse, especially at this moment, but Gukesh around here went to g5, and after queen back to d5, there was a twofold, and after queen d5, Ding Liren was clearly happy to accept what might well be a draw by threefold repetition. But Gukesh in the commentary after the game said, "I like to play chess," and that was his main reason, his drive of queen h4, which very risky, because everything we've just said, well, of course, Ding avoided losing the rook, and now there's a tripled open file, very few weaknesses. Perhaps e3 is white's weakness, but e4 is a bit overextended. f5 is impossible now, and even if it were achieved, there are, as we'll see, issues, let's put it like that, where checkmate may happen. And Black's probably objectively a little worse here. And Gukesh said that he's not that much worse, he realised in the commentary, but perhaps a bit of a risk taken by Gukesh, and well, hats off to him. This is a very interesting position to play on. Let's see how this went. After g6, now here, one of the main reasons white might be a teeny bit better is because c4, and suddenly, well, Black has to tiptoe between trading off into endgames, where these pawns will be much more advanced, or at least a little bit advanced, compared to these, where these are not yet passed pawns. There are pawns in the way, which means it takes a few moves, which, with queens on, weakens the king. Meanwhile, if queens do stay on, this pawn could just run up the board. There's definite scenarios where if the queens trade off, it's an almost automatic win for white, just because their pawns are going to become queens one or two moves more quickly. So they're tight-roping between that and, of course, navigating with the queens on, which is also very tricky. Let's see how Gukesh managed it. Queen could come to d4 here, but instead in the game, after queen to e5, just defending h2, well, there followed rook to e8, queen back to g3, insisting the queens will come off, and Gukesh persisted with declining. If captures, this would be potentially now, because it's black to move and rook e5, everything just said about rooks in the center with centralization and coming over here. Well, if black is doing that themselves, they're no worse, and this would be a draw with the best play. So Ding showing, once again, playing it safe, possibly not going with the ambition of trying to win this position with white, very interestingly. And Gukesh instead played queen h5. Clearly he likes playing chess. And after queen f4, queen a5, getting an attack, and a3 immediately by Ding Liren. And after queen b5, rook d4, isolating this. And it's worth saying, if something like rook 2 here, well, queen b3 should be tried, but by way of illustration, if f5 trying to hold this, then a move like queen h6 or even queen c7, h6 is more accurate, would essentially threaten checkmate. And if they, well, there's no real way to avoid it, queen takes d7 in the long run would be the best way. No way to avoid crashing through like this. And even queen c7, you still will very likely lose this, and black's king is getting ripped apart by the major pieces. So the other difficulty with black's position is f5 isn't possible in a lot of variations, because yes, it makes a pawn chain of connect 4, but it weakens the king in red here significantly. So very tricky play. As it was, rook d7 was not played and rook d4 was going after this. And even f5 here is incredibly risky. Not as actively bad because the rooks aren't here yet, but it's begging for issues to happen. So not something we were likely to see. I think Gukesh would have rather lost the pawn than weakened their king. At least you can hope to draw with a potentially weak e3 pawn in such scenarios where this pawn drops. But queen e2, gaining some counterplay, saying if you capture here, then h2 drops, and, well, yes, c4 might be played, but rook c8's in the way, and queen c7, attacking c4, it's this pawn's running up with h5 in a lot of variations, this king's a bit weak, yeah, it's probably dead level, and all of the advantage of this pawn running up the board more quickly is nullified if a pawn h5 is happening, and of course king b1's probably forcing a lot of variations. So white has to spend a tempo that gives black a chance to play h5, and with best play, this would be roughly a draw. Ding, perhaps he did have some ambition. After queen e2, simply played rook 1 d2, trying to keep pieces on. And at this moment, Gukesh played queen f3. Firstly, if this is accepted, a very favourable version for black, where even after rook f4, rook takes e3, rook f2, this is just trading off to a level drawing. Rook endgames here, where the pawns are evidently symmetrical in the sense that they're both on the respective third ranks. They're moving in more quickly, and with the rooks, that equalizes it out. So taking on f3 wouldn't have gained anything, and very likely there's a risk of being worse. Ding Liren played king c2, and well, this was almost a tacit draw offer because we've mentioned a lot about who has passed pawns more quickly, and now it's black. Now, after the move f5, cementing it as a protected passed pawn, black's no worse, and I just want to look at the alternatives here. If Ding had perhaps played queen g5, perhaps a5, notably if we ever capture this, then e3 will drop, and once again we see black winning the race in a lot of variations. So queen g1 after first king marches up the board, like so, and now after h6, queen g1. And, well, white's stopping the black pawns from running up the board. Meanwhile, c4. And we see that because there's no inhibition, we have a passed pawn here. Because of that, because, once again, with the queens on, black is loath to ever play f5 here and immediately loses for various reasons here, and queen to c1, zipping around. And we see just too many avenues for attack on that king. Meanwhile, this is perfectly safe. And very quickly, if captures, there's an immediate issue with a discovered check, tactically defending e3. So black would have been in a spot of bother, certainly here, but even before blundering. c4, perhaps h5, trying to get the pawn up the board. Maybe there's some hope for black to hold a draw, but it really is pushing the boat out a little bit for white. Instead, we saw pretty much a similar version, except after queen f3, king c2, there followed this, and black does have counterplay now. And as we'll see, h4, trying to go for an offensive against black's kingside. e3 marching forward, and this is a key resource that did not appear in any of the variations just examined. Rook e2, blockading, but it's defended. And after rook e7, preparing to double, and just freeing up this other rook for other duties. King d3, rook e8 from the f8 square. And h5, and Ding's going for it, and it's worth mentioning that if, for example, king g7, in this scenario, let's say we play c4, if black ever tries to run up the board, white has a very important eviction of the king from entering. If this king were to get to g4, f3, well, evidently that could be very, very problematic. And black would have significant counterplay. Even moves like g5 could happen with the king on f3 and f4, and then the rooks will be untethered. Even though we've sacrificed a pawn, those rooks could sit themselves on the g and h files. Very horrible position if we don't stop it. For example, c5, king h5 or g5, and there'd be some chances for black. Still potentially level, but no need to allow this at all. However, that didn't happen because Gukesh captured and giving himself an extra pawn briefly for b5, but obviously risking a little bit. Once again, he likes playing chess. He was trying to play for a win, potentially. But after rook d5, the downside of this is seen. f5 is weakened. There's even rook e5 scenarios, as we'll see. And after h4, rook takes f5. Move 40 has just been made with rook d5. And after captures, check. King walking up the board, rook to a check. This was the threefold that was seen. That reached a draw. And it's worth noting, rook e5 is a tempting move, but it loses because and this did not happen, a draw was agreed shortly with the threefold. But if this happens, rook takes, pawn takes, and the very nice move, check your checks. Rook d2 check. Forces the rooks off the board. Of course, white has to capture. And now it's a bit of a race. Now these two pawns are racing, but there's a third horse in this race. It's a bit of a three-dimensional race. This king is inside of the square here in red, and that means that king will be able to get to the pawn, whereas this pawn after h3, well, there's the square of that pawn. This king is not inside, and so this pawn will queen. Of course, if these both marched up the board, they would queen simultaneously, but that doesn't need to happen. King f6, or indeed, it can wait until here and get to f7. Doesn't matter. And we see black would have won, and, well, that would have turned the tables significantly. As it was, of course, well, champion Ding Liren saw that rook g2 was significantly the better move in all of those moments. As it was, a draw was peacefully agreed here. Well, very interesting level-headed game. Some chances for Ding, but once again, perhaps the one that got away. Possibly in his own head, he was playing it very safe, trying not to risk anything. But had he, perhaps he'd be one up in the match. Of course, it is a rest day tomorrow, and a peaceful result means it is 3-all. And, well, we'll be waiting to see on Tuesday, the 3rd of December, what happens. Let's see how this goes. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Cheers.